linguistics. All right, our final speaker of the day, Geoffrey Bennington, is Asa G. Candler Professor of Modern French Thought, French, and Comparative Literature at Emory University. In addition to his position at Emory, Geoffrey Bennington is also Professor of Philosophy at the European Graduate School, International Fellow at the London Graduate School, and Distinguished Visiting Professor in the School of Humanities at Kingston University. His work as a philosopher and literary critic spans modern French literature and thought, the 18th century novel, literary theory, and deconstruction. Geoffrey is the author of numerous books in French and English, some of which include Lyotard, Writing the Event in 1988, and Late Lyotard in 2005, Dudding, Des Noms de Rousseau in 1991, Sententiousness and the Novel in 1985, Legislations, also in, that was 1985, Legislations is 1995, Interrupting Derrida in 2000, and Jacques Derrida, which he co-wrote with Jacques Derrida in 1991. Geoffrey is, in addition to co-editor of Geschlecht III and member of the French editorial team for Derrida's works, a founding member of the Derrida Seminars Translation Project, and co-editor of the Seminars of Jacques Derrida, published by the University of Chicago Press. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that he is one of the most renowned and respected translators of Derrida and Lyotard's work into English. Most recently, in 2017, Geoffrey published Kant on the Frontier, Philosophy, Politics, and the Ends of the Earth with Fordham University Press. This work, originally published in French in 2000, takes up the all-too-critical question of the frontier by following its logic in Kant's philosophical and political writings. Before that, in 2016, he published Scatter 1, The Politics of Politics in Foucault, Heidegger, and Derrida, also with Fordham, and for which we had the pleasure of hosting Jeff here at Texas A&M only a few years ago, thanks to Alberto. Scatter 1 asked to what extent the rhetoric of politics, so often derided, might in fact be an irreducible element of politics itself, and it promised a second volume, for which we are eager, but not impatient, and in which the ramifications of this insight would be explored for political philosophy at large. Today, Geoffrey will be presenting Geschlecht, pollachōs, legetai, Derrida's Heidegger, and Aristotle. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Adam, for that generous introduction and for organizing this event. Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to my co-editors on this volume for really doing almost all the work. I've got some epigraphs which will be familiar to you probably from things that have already been said, but I'll nonetheless read them just to set up the initial problematic of the talk. You have the text in English. I'll read the quotes in French. First one, ce mot, je le laisse ici dans sa langue pour des raisons qui devraient s'imposer au cours de cette lecture même. Il s'agit bien de Geschlecht, du mot pour sexe, race, famille, génération, lignée, espèce, genre, et non du Geschlecht. On ne franchira pas si facilement vers la chose même, le Geschlecht, la marque du mot Geschlecht, dans laquelle beaucoup plus tard Heidegger remarquera l'empreinte du coup ou de la frappe. And a little later in the same text, Geschlecht 1, beaucoup plus tard, et en tout cas 30 ans après, le mot Geschlecht se chargera de toute sa richesse polysémique, sexe, genre, famille, souche, race, lignée, génération. Heidegger suivra dans la langue à travers des frayages irremplaçables, entendant inaccessible à une traduction courante, à travers des voies labyrinthiques, séduisantes, inquiétantes, l'empreinte de chemins souvent fermés. And then just to hammer home the point, I don't know why that went away.
Went the other way.
I had it upside down. Okay, this is the third and last epigraph. Je viens de dire le mot Geschlecht, c'est que je ne suis pas sûr qu'il ait un référent déterminable et unifiable. Je ne suis pas sûr qu'on puisse parler du Geschlecht au-delà du mot Geschlecht, qui se trouve donc nécessairement cité, entre guillemets, mentionné plutôt qu'utilisé. Ensuite, je le laisse en allemand. aucun mot à mot ne suffira à traduire celui-ci qui rassemble dans sa valeur idiomatique la souche, la race, la famille, l'espèce, le genre, la génération, le sexe. Puis, après avoir dit le mot Geschlecht, je me suis repris ou corrigé la marque Geschlecht, ai-je précisé, car le thème de mon analyse reviendrait à une sorte de composition ou de décomposition qui affecte justement l'unité de ce mot. Peut-être n'est-ce plus un mot. Geschlecht is said in many ways, and as is perhaps a little perversely most clearly brought out through the trial of translation from German into French and then into English, Geschlecht means, in a retranslation of Derrida's initial list from Geschlecht I, which I was just reading out, sex, genus or gender, family, stock, race, lineage, generation. In that same quotation, Derrida refers to this multiplicity of meanings as a richesse polysémique, a polysemic wealth or richness. In the somewhat mysterious version intermédiaire of the text of part of Geschlecht III, it's a text that seems to have been written between the seminar on which it's based and the so-called Loyola typescript that Rodrigo was telling us about this morning. In that strange intermediate version, Derrida writes, mais que veut dire Geschlecht? Sexe, race, espèce, genre, famille, souche, etc. Et d'abord, type. It's not going to be on the screen, sorry. Et d'abord, type, mot qui renvoie mieux à tuptein, frapper, which we were just hearing about. So what does Geschlecht mean? Sex, race, species, genus or gender, family, stock, etc. And first of all, type, a word which refers better to tuptein, to strike. End of quote. In the text published as Geschlecht II, Derrida gives a slightly different list in a slightly different order. This was also one of the epigraphs, now giving the candidate translations definite articles. La souche, la race, la famille, l'espèce, le genre, la génération, le sexe, stock, race, family, species, genus or gender, generation, sex, and goes so far as to suggest that this multiplicity of meanings is held together, insofar as it is held together at all, only by the word Geschlecht, by the signifier Geschlecht, which then seems to mean that its very status as a word, and even indeed as a signifier, is cast into doubt if that is a word only insofar as it can be tethered to a meaning, and a signifier only insofar as it can be tethered to a signified. So perhaps Geschlecht is not even a word, not even a signifier, merely a mark, as Derrida calls it, and a mark that, if we take seriously Heidegger's reading of it as entailing a Schlag, a mark that remarks its own status as a mark or a stamp or an imprint. Heidegger himself, translating German into German in a process that has been mentioned several times, and that Heidegger himself thematizes, as I think Rodrigo reminded us, in, for example, in his 1942 lecture course on Hölderlin's hymn De Easter, Heidegger, translating German into German, as it were, twice in the Trakl essay, only twice, explicitly unpacks the senses of Geschlecht, initially as follows, and I'll give it first in the inevitably more or less incomprehensible English translation by Peter Hertz, who translates it, a human cast in one mold and cast away into this cast is called a kin, of a kind, a generation. The word refers to mankind as a whole, as well as kinship in the sense of race, tribe, family, all of these in turn cast in the duality of the sexes. Now, in this case, and in many other cases, which I'll give a few examples perhaps, the admittedly impossible task of translating Heidegger's German begins by simply omitting Heidegger's remarking of the fact of German, of unsere Sprache. You see in the Heidegger quote, the English translation just lets that go. And in so doing misses what will be a crucial point for Derrida's reading. I'll let you look at the German on the screen. Now, it's true, somewhat perhaps in Hertz's defense, that this simple fact of marking or remarking by and in a language of the language that it is, here by the use of the expression unsere Sprache, is the very exemplar of the radically untranslatable. This is a kind of untranslatability that's not just an extension of difficulty in translation. Anybody can translate unsere Sprache as our language. It makes no sense to say in English our language when you really mean German. The difficulty is on a different level. Now, Derrida does elsewhere point to this type of untranslatability around about the same time, in the early 1980s, in relation to the translation of Descartes' Discours de la méthode into Latin, and the translator's choice simply to omit from the Latin version Descartes' explanation of why the text was written in French in the first place. The paragraph just drops out of the text. And Derrida, in that discussion, talks about a kind of suicide by translation. It's his expression of the idiomatic moment at which a language points to itself as itself in this way. Now, I should say this kind of suicide by translation happens a lot in Hertz's version of Heidegger's essay on Trakel. And it's as if he, the translator, took a decision in principle simply to omit or change quite radically every occasion on which Heidegger's German explicitly remarks on the fact of its being German. Or as Derrida puts it, when Heidegger, tout en se tenant ou en revenant vers le lieu d'origine, opère déjà une traduction à l'intérieur de l'allemand, des Allemands de différents âges, de différentes générations, ouvrier allemand, allemand moderne, code philosophique, code courant, etc. Heidegger opère déjà une sorte de va-et-vient traducteur germano-germain. And Derrida, in a gesture that Rodrigo was talking about this morning, goes on immediately to make a claim that, if it's true, would probably mean that the English version of the text that's published in On the Way to Language is, in a fairly strict sense, unreadable, incomprehensible, and unusable, as it certainly is for academic purposes such as ours. Derrida says, I don't have this on the quote, but he says it's this coming and going. Oops, I do have it on there. It's the second part of this quote, I think. C'est ce va-et-vient, son explication en allemand moderne au courant de ce que le haut vieil allemand voulait dire, qui nous permet de traduire en français et de parler comme je le fais. C'est parce que Heidegger se livre à cette traduction vers ou depuis le sens originel de sens que des Allemands déjà peuvent le lire, à supposer qu'ils le fassent. Take a few minutes just to give a sense of how widespread this gesture or this suicide by translation is in the English translation. I say this because if you're familiar with the Heidegger essay simply through the English translation, most of what Derrida says will make no sense at all. It's as if he's talking about something quite different. So it's important to at least note the fact. I'm not going to give every example, but there are many cases, let's say, where it seems as if someone reading Derrida after reading the Hertz translation would simply, as it were, miss what I'm tempted to call the point. For example, first example, the point of the spear, which Heidegger suggests is the original sense of the word Ort, the point of the lance or of the spear or of the sword, goes entirely missing. Ursprünglich bedeutet der Name Ort die Spitze des Speers. In English this becomes, originally the word sight suggests a place in which everything comes together, is concentrated. Not sure that's even true. As also does the explicit reference to the Schlag, the blow of the curse or malediction affecting the Geschlecht immediately after the passage about the word Geschlecht in Heidegger's initial unpacking of it, simply missing from the translation. Same again with the use of the word Leise, where Heidegger again appeals to an old High German word, leise heißt langsam. And so on, the translation has simply and incomprehensibly, however, quiet means slow. Slowly fading away. And I could show the same thing with the terms that Heidegger foregrounds, Jena, Geist, Wahn, and Sinn. I think the only exception, for reasons we could speculate about in the translation, comes in the case of Fremde, where Hertz does for once include the explicit reference to the German language, English translation, but the word we're using, the German Fremd, Old High German, Fram, really means forward to somewhere else, underway toward. We were also mentioning this earlier. Another very perverse effect of the translation is that Derrida complains in his discussion of the contrast in Heidegger's text between the geistig and the geistlich, that Heidegger does not exploit a whole possible dimension of the notion of Geist, which would be Derrida's interest in haunting, spectrality, and so on. The English translation systematically, or fairly systematically, refers to things that are geistlich as ghostly. So on the basis of the English translation, you would think Heidegger does talk about exactly the thing that Derrida says he doesn't talk about, and that he never talks about the things that Derrida says that he is talking about. So this is a pretty radical and strange situation. It's true that Derrida himself says, quite generously, I think, in a text, Ulysse Gramophone, he's talking about the translation into French of Joyce, and he says, Ne médisons jamais d'une traduction. Let's never speak ill of a translation. Not clear to me he always follows that advice, or perhaps we can be critical without speaking ill. All that to say, in any case, that if we tried to read Derrida's Geschlecht III on the basis of the text as translated in On the Way to Language, we would really understand basically nothing. Towards the end of the essay, commenting this time on that emphatic spaced out ein of ein Geschlecht that Katie was just talking about, and coming back for his second and last time to the different senses of the word Geschlecht, Heidegger gives a slightly different sequence while explicitly referring to his earlier unpacking that I quoted earlier. So there again, there's the English translation and the German original. The word generation, that's how he's translating Geschlecht. It seems a slightly strange choice among many admittedly unpromising candidates for the word Geschlecht. In the earlier moment, you may have noticed Hertz resorted to that old translator's trick, of which I absolutely disapprove, of giving several possible versions. So one word in the German gets unpacked as three words in the translation, as though there were three words in the German. There he translates Geschlecht as kin, of a kind, generation, as if Heidegger had used three different words. The word generation, then he goes on, here retains the full manifold meaning mentioned earlier. For one thing, it names the historical generation of man. Mankind is distinct from all other living beings, plants and animals. Of course, generation in English means no such thing. It's strictly incomprehensible. Next, the word generation names the races, tribes, clans, and families of mankind. Not really. And at the same time, the word always refers to the twofoldness of the sexes, which of course the word generation does not. So, Geschlecht is indeed said in many ways, but those many ways are not, as it were, all on the same level. Geschlecht in its initial spread, as Heidegger gives it, in what looks like a fairly clearly ordered or hierarchized, almost lineal form, so something like in an order of decreasing generality, genus, species, stock, tribe, family. That ordering is set over against Geschlecht in the binary terms of sex or gender, the Zwiefalt of the two sexes or genders. And this second type of meaning of Geschlecht, male-female, what Heidegger will characterize as the second Schlag that comes to overprint or overtype the first, affects in return all the terms of the first lineal spread, so that each of those terms, genus, species, and so on, is wiederum, de nouveau, in turn, supplementarily, as Derrida glosses it in one of his discussions of this passage, supplementarily struck by the gender distinction that Heidegger's Trakel will characterize as a curse or a malediction. Now, this is quite complex, but not obviously unmasterable, disordered, or crazy multiplicity of the possible meanings of the word or mark Geschlecht, thematized as such, will in due course be the occasion for Derrida to wield a pair of terms from his own semi-technical vocabulary. It will turn out that the value of polysemia, which you may remember from the epigraphs he used in Geschlecht I to describe Geschlecht, the word Geschlecht. He also uses it in de l'esprit, of spirit, where Derrida says that Geschlecht is a word that is, quoting de l'esprit, redoutablement polysémique, formidably or redoubtably polysemic. It will turn out that that value of the polysemic is itself cast into doubt by those very same features of Geschlecht that, according to Geschlecht II, make it perhaps not even a word but more of a mark, you remember from the epigram. And so the concept of polysemia, which Derrida, as we've seen, does appeal to, he needs to displace it or complicate it by his own notion of dissemination. So there's a whole discussion in Geschlecht III of the terms polysemia and dissemination as a way of getting at what Derrida thinks might be problematic, or part of what he thinks might be problematic in Heidegger's discussion. So in the 9th session of the seminar, from which Geschlecht III has been extracted, Derrida writes the following. He's getting ready to discuss what Heidegger in this context calls Mehrdeutigkeit. So, si je me sers du mot dissémination, ce n'est pas pour recentrer les choses vers un certain mot que j'ai naguère privilégié et qui dit tout sauf le recentrement. C'est pour mieux faire apparaître un rapport que je crois nécessaire entre la scène du Geschlecht, comme scène à la fois sexuelle et généalogique, d'engendrement et de génération d'une part, et la question plus étroitement langagière qui s'abrite dans le couple impossible que j'appelle dissémination polysémie. So this privileging of the word dissemination, which strictly speaking I guess Derrida should probably, by his own lights, not so simply refer to either as a word or, as we'll see him doing in a moment, as a concept. This privileging that he's referring to is presumably looking back to the 1972 volume that bears the title La Dissémination, and within it the text on the eponymous essay about Philippe Solers, which I'm fairly certain nobody much reads these days. Or he might be referring for shorthand to the quite trenchant and probably more familiar earlier remarks from the famous essay Signature Event Context, where Derrida, obviously simplifying things, he's going very fast in that essay, first describes himself as opposing, it's his word, dissemination to polysemia, and then goes on to suggest the need to écarter, to separate out or place at a distance what he now indeed calls the concept of dissemination from that of polysemia, before finally, third occurrence in that essay, glossing dissemination as an irreducible polysemia in the discussion of J.L. Austin. These are familiar and famous moments, I think. Now, in spite of some, I think, slightly misleading appearances, including appearances that Derrida perhaps encourages in his own summary at the end of Geschlecht II of what is to come in Geschlecht III, in spite of those appearances, Derrida's mobilization of the word or concept, or let's say mark, dissemination, in reading Heidegger is not in fact directly to do with the latter's understanding or interlingual translation of the word or concept or mark Geschlecht at all. Heidegger at the end of the essay is no longer talking directly about Geschlecht in its many senses. It's perhaps worth pointing out Derrida nowhere contests Heidegger's cashing out of the different senses of that term. Heidegger's no longer talking about that, and he's pursuing the more general question of what sort then is the language of Trakel's poetic work. and he affirms an essential ambiguity or plurivocity in the language of Trakls poetry. Heidegger says that poetry is wesenhaft mehrdeutig, and this Mehrdeutigkeit Heidegger originally derives from the structure of Abgeschiedenheit that he's previously put forward as the word that best characterizes the unspoken Gedicht that all of Trakls poems are, in his view, speaking in a certain sense. Now there's a quite complex and even slightly confusing sequence that Derrida does not fully reconstruct. Neither will I in all its detail, but Heidegger generates that notion of Mehrdeutigkeit broadly as follows. All the major terms, says Heidegger, that we have been discussing. He gives a list: twilight and night, descent and death, madness and wild game, pond and tone, bird's flight and boat, stranger and brother, ghost and god, and also the words of color, blue and green, white and black, red and silver, gold and dark, all say ever and again manifold things. That's Heidegger. So all the major terms he's been discussing are zweideutig, but that preliminary ambiguity, or literally two-sidedness, two-meaningness, is itself only one side of the true Mehrdeutigkeit that Heidegger's here trying to characterize, which Mehrdeutigkeit seems to consist in a kind of second-level Zweideutigkeit, one of the sides of which is this first level, rather simple ambiguity or Zweideutigkeit that he's just been listing, and the other side of which is determined by, Heidegger says, the innermost site of the Gedicht that Heidegger has just characterized in terms of that Abgeschiedenheit, from which he started his discussion of Mehrdeutigkeit a page earlier. Now, only after that initial claim has led to this more complex Zweideutigkeit, as Heidegger calls it, does Heidegger contrast the Mehrdeutigkeit thus derived with what Derrida will describe as a Heideggerian and indeed classical understanding of dissemination, so that this Mehrdeutigkeit does not devolve into what Heidegger calls an indeterminate Vieldeutigkeit. So we've got Zweideutigkeit, Mehrdeutigkeit, Vieldeutigkeit. Zweideutigkeit is the simpler version, Mehrdeutigkeit is the Zweideutigkeit. Vieldeutigkeit would be the bad place to go that Derrida is suggesting Heidegger is, in a sense, repressing or not wanting to think, which seems to be associated with what Derrida calls dissemination. So Heidegger says this Mehrdeutigkeit that characterizes Trakls poetry does not devolve into indeterminate Vieldeutigkeit. It does not, I'm quoting the English translation, does not scatter in vague equivocations. One good point for the translation, scatter. Not scatter in vague equivocations, or as Derrida puts it in his French gloss, cette pluralité de sens du dire poétique ne s'éparpille pas, ne se dissémine pas, doesn't scatter, I guess, doesn't disseminate, ne devient pas éparse dans le vent de ci de là d'une polyvalence indéterminée. The German flattert nicht ins unbestimmte vieldeutige Auseinander. So it's not just go off in all directions in an indeterminate kind of way. A little bit later, Derrida characterizes Heidegger's discussion like this: la polysémie mehrdeutige de ce dire poétique n'est pas, dit avec une sorte de mépris évident, das Ungenaue des Lässigen, l'imprécision, l'inexactitude, le flou du laisser-aller, de la nonchalance, de l'insouciance, mais la rigueur, die Strenge, du laisser-être. Heidegger oppose le laisser-aller. All these interpositions are Derrida's, of course. Heidegger oppose le laisser-aller, Lässigen, au laisser-être, lassenden, qui a consenti, eingelassen au souci, au scrupule de la gerechten Anschauung. This is where Derrida presses Aristotle into service as a way of trying to take some distance from Heidegger's contrasting this good Mehrdeutigkeit or polysemia to what Heidegger would have to think of as a bad dissemination. And here's Derrida's opening statement of that. Par un geste que je trouve pour ma part très classique, voire aristotélicien, je dirai pourquoi dans un instant, Heidegger n'imagine pas d'autre alternative que celle d'une polysémie rassemblée ou rassemblante dans l'unité de ton du Gedicht, poésie de rigueur, et d'autre part, une dispersion négligée, floue, sans lieu en somme, celle de l'indétermination du n'importe quoi, de la multiplicité irréductible des tons et du sens qui, pour Heidegger, ne peut relever que du laisser-aller. Il ne peut pas y avoir de pensée ou d'écriture poétique rigoureuse de la dissémination. That final sentence obviously summarizing what Derrida takes to be Heidegger's view of the matter. Now, I have to say that here Derrida, and perhaps not just here, perhaps a little more generally in Geschlecht III, and perhaps elsewhere in his dealings with Heidegger, there's a little pleasurable moment of Derrida playing gotcha with Heidegger. He's quite pleased with himself, clearly. The pour ma part, a little pour ma part, je trouve pour ma part. It's not a gesture of modesty, it's more of a preening gesture. I'm smart enough to see this, and I'm pleased that I've caught Heidegger out here being classical, not only being classical, but being Aristotelian, as though Aristotle were the very example of what it is to be classical. And in fact, in the summary that Derrida gives in Geschlecht II, he says that Heidegger's gesture here is proprement aristotélicien, which would be an interesting thing to pursue as a formula all on its own, given that the propre, or the idion, is the focus of Derrida's readings of Aristotle elsewhere. So to call somebody proprement aristotélicien is itself a kind of Aristotelian gesture. So it's slightly strange that Derrida would do that. Now, it's not exactly, says Derrida, that Aristotle, any more than Heidegger, denounces polysemia as such, but here's Derrida glossing. C'est que pour Aristote, la polysémie est acceptable. Un mot est donc tout ce qui se fait avec des mots. Phrase texte peut avoir plusieurs sens à la condition que cette pluralité soit ordonnée et unifiable, qu'elle ait en tant que pluralité de sens un foyer de sens. Sans quoi, dit Aristote, par exemple, ne pas signifier une chose unique, c'est ne pas signifier du tout. Now, there's already something a little strange about the relation between these two sentences, I think, in that the quote from the Metaphysics, as Derrida glosses it in the second sentence, with its slightly odd opening sans quoi, would seem to rule out the very polysemia described in his first sentence. So if Aristotle really thought that ne pas signifier une chose unique, c'est ne pas signifier du tout, then it's difficult to see how he could even allow for the plusieurs sens that Derrida says Aristotle can tolerate. Now, in fact, this same passage of the Metaphysics, given with a lot more context and commentary, was already quoted at length by Derrida during his famous and brilliant reading of Aristotle in La Mythologie Blanche. There, Derrida seems to be, he introduces the quotation, from the Metaphysics with a preliminary gloss that seems to be making the same point he's making in Geschlecht III. Un nom est propre quand il n'a qu'un seul sens, mieux c'est seulement dans ce cas qu'il est proprement un nom. L'université est l'essence, ou mieux le télos du langage. Cet idéal aristotélicien, aucune philosophie en tant que telle n'y a jamais renoncé. Il est la philosophie. Aristote reconnaît qu'un mot peut avoir plusieurs sens, c'est un fait. Mais ce fait n'a droit de langage que dans la mesure où la polysémie est finie, où les différentes significations sont en nombre limité et surtout assez distinctes, chacune restant une et identifiable. Le langage n'est ce qu'il est, langage, que pour autant qu'il peut alors maîtriser et analyser la polysémie. Sans reste, une dissémination non maîtrisable n'est même pas une polysémie, elle appartient au dehors du langage. And he goes on to gloss. I won't read out this quote, it's a little bit long, but you'll remember that if it's no longer within language, it's no longer within humanity, and anybody who does this kind of disseminatory thing is outside humanity and is probably more like a plant, as he says at the end. It seems to be no better than a mere plant. So if you're going for dissemination on the view of Derrida's Aristotle, you're not using language, you're therefore not human, you're really just a vegetable. Now, these are famous passages from Book Gamma of the Metaphysics that Derrida is invoking here. They seem to be satisfyingly univocal in their affirmation of the telos of univocity and the necessary reducibility of polysemia. But they do, it seems to me, sit in a relationship that might need some further clarification with Aristotle's equally famous, oft-repeated slogan, though not often repeated by Derrida, interestingly, namely that being is said in many ways, to on pollachōs legetai, a slogan that Heidegger himself spends a good deal of time unpacking in detail in courses in 1930 and 1931. The recognition of the reality of polysemia in Aristotle is in fact usually negotiated not simply by the demand that words have one and only one meaning, as Derrida here and elsewhere seems to suggest, but rather by a structure usually referred to by Aristotle with the words pros hen, with reference to one. This is what Derrida is reflecting when in the summary he gives in Geschlecht II, he says that in the trichal text, Heidegger thematizes both polysemia and the focal simplicity of Geschlecht in our language. This simplicité focale, or what he also calls a foyer de sens, Derrida, and to which he also appeals in other texts, seems fairly clearly to be gesturing towards a notion of focal meaning that indeed became in the Aristotle scholarship a dominant way of understanding the relationship between the pollachōs legomenon in Aristotle and the need somehow to get on top of that multiplicity, not to deny that multiplicity, but to get on top of it in some way to prevent it getting out of hand without, however, reducing it quite as directly and brutally as Derrida seems to suggest to the simplicity of one and only one meaning. Aristotle says famously, being is said in many ways. In fact, there are many things that Aristotle says are said in many ways. He never suggests that those ways amount to only one way, that there is a way of understanding those many ways involved around this focal meaning or this notion of they're all gesturing towards some kind of one, the pros hen structure. Now, although the exact grounds for that description in terms of focus or focal simplicity are not in fact present in the passage from Metaphysics Gamma that Derrida is relying on, both in Geschlecht III and in La Mythologie Blanche to establish Aristotle's position on meaning, they become clearer in Aristotle's treatment elsewhere in the metaphysics of what he often describes in terms of homonymy. In situations where terms are non-contingently homonymous, so we're not talking about merely factitious homonyms like bank in the sense of a financial institution and bank in the sense of a river bank. That's a homonym, but it's a factitious or contingent one in Aristotle's view. The pros hen structure, the principle of what then, as I was saying, indeed became called in the scholarship focal meaning. I think nowadays the Aristotelians usually call it core-dependent homonymy. I think that's the more recent fashion. That structure provides for both a recognition of the reality of the pollachōs legomenon and a way of organizing that multiplicity, so that there is, says Aristotle in one of his favorite illustrative examples, some relation we might want to specify between the different senses of the word healthy when it's used, for example, of a diet, an appetite, an exercise, a complexion, or a lifestyle, in that all those different senses are not the same. It's not the same sense, but they're all clearly related. Conducive to health, causing health, indicative of health, and so on. These uses are not synonymous, but nor is their homonymy contingent, as in the two senses of the word bank that I mentioned. Maybe Geschlecht could be described as a homonym in this pros hen sense. At any rate, this appeal to a focal meaning or a core-dependent homonymy is slightly less absolutist in Aristotle in its demand for unicity of meaning than Derrida seems to suggest in his invocation of the passage he quotes in La Mythologie Blanche and Geschlecht III. And it even leaves open the extent to which even the term focus or the term core might be the most appropriate terms with which to understand it. Some philosophers have thought that family resemblance, sorry to anticipate on your title, Adam, in Wittgenstein's sense, might be another less restrictive way of thinking about the kind of way that these senses are grouped together. And family resemblance would obviously resonate in our current context. This way of thinking about the pollachōs opens a little space in which it might be possible and interesting to give Aristotle a slightly more generous reading than Derrida here, or indeed typically, gives him. So I don't think, for example, there's any real example in Derrida's treatment of Aristotle of the kind of reading he devotes to Plato in Plato's Pharmacy, to which he indeed alludes here in Geschlecht III, where he's able to bring out famously a Plato not reducible to the Plato of Platonism. So if I put things a little abruptly, Derrida most often seems to line Aristotle up with the Plato of Platonism, having them equally grounding what he calls the metaphysics of presence, as though the possibility of opening a space between Aristotle and Aristotelianism were not of any interest to him, and as though Aristotle were always and univocally proprement Aristotelicien. This has some virtues of simplicity, but it arguably buys that simplicity at the price of reducing Aristotle's persistent criticism of Plato to merely epiphenomenal status in the history of Western metaphysics as metaphysics of presence. And insofar as Heidegger, at least in his earlier work, is much more persistent and careful in his dealings with Aristotle, this sense that Derrida's Aristotle is a little simplified might have some relevance more generally to Derrida's dealings with Heidegger, and suggests some rereading done in a Derridian spirit, as it were, a spirit explicitly formulated here in Geschlecht III, where Derrida, for example, suggests that Heidegger shouldn't be so confident in identifying in Trakl, in denying the importance of Platonico-Christian concepts in Trakl, because to do so you have to assume that those concepts are univocal. Perhaps they're not. At that point we could give a more generous reading that wouldn't be as rigid as Heidegger. But maybe we could suggest that the same thing could be done around Derrida's reading of Aristotle, and by extension his reading of Heidegger, who is here accusing, it is an accusation, of being classical or even Aristotelian. Now I'll try to move to a conclusion reasonably rapidly. In Geschlecht III, this criticism of Heidegger's supposed Aristotelianism is not matched by a positive account of what Derrida understands by dissemination, if dissemination is not to be thought in the negative terms that Derrida suggests Heidegger would have to think it in, as the mere scatter of vague equivocations, laissez-aller, without any unifying principle, and so on. So if there is a possible pensée rigoureuse de la dissémination, we're not going to find it formulated as such in this text. We're going to have to look for it somewhere else in Derrida. And of course, that term is the object of explicit reflection in a number of places. Most famously, perhaps, near the beginning of the, over that third interview in Positions from 1972, where he suggests that dissemination enters into the famous string of non-synonymous substitutions, supplement writing, pharmacon, and so on. And in the piece on Solès from the book La Dissémination, piece I was suggesting nobody much reads anymore, there's another quite long, quite detailed attempt to distinguish between polysemia or polythematism and dissemination. And what becomes clearer, I think, in these descriptions is that in spite of some of the hastier remarks or more expeditious remarks he makes in signature event context, dissemination and polysemia certainly are not to be opposed, they're not to be located at the same level. Maybe that's why he refers to them as a couple impossible. So although he writes here in this text that entre la polysémie et la dissémination, la différence est très petite, there's a very small difference, in a sense that difference is also immense or immeasurable. because it seems to involve a radical incommensurability that means there's simply no way of quantifying the difference between them. The suggestion would be that dissemination is not merely an exacerbated polysemia or a polysemia that's got a little bit out of hand compared to the Aristotelian and what Derrida thinks of as the Heideggerian model for it. The claim here is that semantics, which would be the domain of a possible polysemia, has structure, which he here calls the differential as its condition, without itself, at least in its own view of itself, in the semantics of semantics, if you like, being structural or differential. So polysemia is a semantic value. Dissemination, far from being the disorganized meaning scatter that Derrida's Heidegger thinks it is a syntactic value. And Derrida is also explicit about this at the end of the White Mythology, where he talks about un supplément de résistance syntaxique, and still more so in the reading of Mallarmé in the double session, where he firmly subordinates the semantic values even of the loaded word hymen, which seemed to be doing so much good deconstructive work in that reading. He firmly subordinates the semantic values of that term to the syntactic value signaled by the word between, and goes on to refer to, I'm quoting, the irreducible excess of the syntactic over the semantic. So a putative, rigorous account of dissemination doesn't really rely on the thought of an exacerbated polysemia at all, and so unmasterable or irreducible polysemia doesn't quite seem to capture it. Rather, dissemination thought in a Derridian way seems to require the inscription of what we might call a quasi-semantic placeholder, signifying, remarking in a supplementary way the play of syntax or of the differential in general, the trace in general, as the non-semantic condition of semantic effects. That's what Derrida's claiming in this quote. And we could confirm that configuration in the discussion of part 2 of the double session of Jean-Pierre Richard's thematic reading of Mallarmé. You'll remember that a crucial part of that reading involves pointing out that certain supposed themes, what Richard calls themes, exemplarily for Derrida the themes of white or blank, blanc, and pli or fold, are not merely two themes or motifs among others, they're not even exceptionally important themes that might be plausibly thought to be superordinate or otherwise focal with respect to other themes. What's interesting about them for Derrida is that they also remark the relation of all the supposed themes among themselves, such that blanc also refers to the blanks or the gaps or the spacing between all the other themes that allows them to appear as identifiable themes in their relative semantic dispersion. Now, at least on occasion, Derrida presents dissemination understood in this way as involving not so much a semantic superabundance, but a certain poverty or monotony. So when he's contesting Richard's reading of a kind of semantic copia, perhaps a Mehrdeutigkeit in Mallarmé's motifs of the fold and the blank, Derrida writes, really getting near the end, le pli donc et le blanc qui nous interdiront de chercher un thème ou un sens total au-delà des instances textuelles dans un imaginaire, une intentionnalité ou un vécu. Richard voit dans le blanc et dans le pli les thèmes d'une plurivalence particulièrement féconde ou exubérante. Ce qu'on ne voit pas dans l'abondance de son relevé, c'est que ces effets de texte sont riches par une pauvreté, je dirais presque une monotonie très singulière, très régulière aussi. On ne le voit pas parce qu'on croit voir des thèmes au lieu où le non-thème, ce qui ne peut devenir thème, cela même qui n'a pas de sens, se remarque sans cesse, c'est-à-dire disparaît. So blank and fold are not only themes, though they can always be misrecognized as themes, and perhaps cannot not be so misrecognized, but more especially they're the relatively monotonous remarking of what makes a theme both possible and impossible. And the monotony of this textual system cannot be exhibited as such, quick version of why la trace n'arrive qu'à s'effacer, but it's brought out or indirectly indicated by a reading process that identifies what I just called quasi-semantic placeholders. Now, it may be that the most promising or memorable of these placeholders supplement writing Différence Pharmakon, perhaps now Geschlecht, exhibits some of the features that from a semantic point of view might be considered polysemic, but this does not seem to be an essential feature of them. The syntax remarked by these placeholders can be taken in an extremely broad sense, as Derrida often takes that term of syntax, but the monotony might yet invite a closer comparison than Derrida might have expected, certainly from me, with what Heidegger calls the singular, unique, or as we might say, why not relatively monotonous, Gedicht of a great poet. That monotony may not be something we would want to identify with anything like Jean-Pierre Richard's rich univers imaginaire of Mallarmé, but we might still wonder if the monos of the monotonous remark does not invite rereading against all the unifying or gathering motifs that Derrida is so, I think, rightly suspicious of in Heidegger. But we might even, in the principle of a more generous reading, wonder whether that kind of monotony or writing textuality, trace, dissemination, différence, but also everywhere suicide by translation beckons, whether that's really so clearly distinguishable from what Heidegger repeatedly characterizes in terms of oneness, unity, uniqueness, Einklang, and so on. Last paragraph. In that more generous reading of Aristotle I was suggesting Derrida makes possible but never really pursues, I look forward to exploring the fact that one of the major terms described as a pollachōs legomenon by Aristotle, as there's not just being, there are many of them, one of the other ones is precisely to hen, the one, to the multiple saying of which a whole book of the metaphysics is devoted. That's book Iota. We might think that once the one is said in many ways, then the whole logic of the pros hen as a way of finding some kind of order in the multiplicity of the pollachōs is complicated by something like a fold, an abyssal fractal self-similarity, whereby each time the pros hen seems to be reaching toward the one, that one, because it's said in many ways, opens up a new pollachōs, and so on indefinitely. And read this way, the pros hen seems not quite as irredeemably teleological as most interpretations would have it, and the Platonizing, Neo-Platonizing and Christianizing tendencies of Aristotelianism might be understood as a process whereby just that abyssal complexity of Aristotle himself, as it were, would be what is being reduced, and that progressive reduction would be a crucial part of the very construction of a tradition of what we now, since Heidegger and Derrida, call the metaphysics of presence. So this pollachōs legetai of the one might then, if we could attempt a reading of Aristotle not mortgaged to Aristotelianism, might resonate with Derrida's own apparently non-Aristotelian and non-Heideggerian understanding of the one, which leads to such untranslatable formulas as l'un se fait violence, l'un se garde de l'autre. It would also have effects on our understanding of political theology, so that Derrida's rapid alignment of Aristotle and Plato in robes in terms of their supposedly common political salute to the one God would certainly bear some further deconstructive attention. And maybe it affects also the most famous pollachōs legomenon of all, the multiple saying of being itself, including Heidegger's saying of being and his readings of Aristotle in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. I like this alternative you're presenting, this alternative reading of Aristotle, the way to rehabilitate Aristotle against Derrida's perhaps reductive critique. I'm thinking also of people like Pierre Leblanc, who does this to some extent with sort of a formatic reading of Aristotle. And I'm wondering whether we couldn't try to do something similar with Heidegger, so just kind of carrying out what a generous reading of Heidegger would be with respect to what you're talking about, or what Heidegger might reply. He might say, well, okay, I effectively am turning myself into a plant because there's a sense in which I'm denying the principle of non-contradiction or violating it. My one is actually multiple. There's many folds to my one. Spirit can break out into tender releasement, but it can also break out into insurrection. And I effectively am accounting for the possibility of dissemination. There is a kind of rigorous thinking going on here. Namely, we have these different blows. Eventually, we get to the corrupt race, Geschlecht. And so I wonder about that possibility, what you think about that. And then maybe the objection there would be not so much Heidegger's logic, but his attempt to then try to redeem everything and say, well, eventually we'll get to sort of just releasement. We'll get just to tenderness. And so it seems to me like that last move is problematic in Heidegger, but I'm not sure that the charge that there's no rigorous thinking of dissemination in Heidegger really comes up.
Derrida claims Heidegger would say there could be no such rigorous thinking. He's not saying Heidegger does not have a rigorous thinking of dissemination exactly. He's saying on Heidegger's view, dissemination could only ever be the laisser-aller, the blowing in the wind, the scattering, the strewing of sense in a random kind of way. And of course, there's plenty of evidence throughout Heidegger's corpus of gestures of that sort. So I'm certainly not saying that Heidegger's treatment of these issues without further ado can withstand the deconstructive attention. But what I do think is that once we recognize, and this seems to be a really hard-won position, even though I think it can be stated reasonably simply, which is there's no gathering without scattering and there's no scattering without gathering. It seems remarkably hard to get to the point where one can make that claim without having to fight with Hegel all over again and so on and so forth. But if we could accept that view, that the concept of scatter, for example, which as you know is a concept I like, if it is a concept, entails a certain limitation on its own scatter. An absolute scatter is not a scatter. We'll be back in Hegel again. So scatter is scatter only to the extent that it's not absolute scatter. To that point, it's somewhat gathered. And similarly, a gathering is no longer exactly a gathering if it's a complete reduction to a one self-identity. So we've got some kind of tension between, let's say, a gathering and a more scattering type of motion. And I think Derrida is in a way thrilled with Heidegger for just the reason that he can see that in Heidegger, right? The course, the 63-64 course, where he consistently contrasts Heidegger with Hegel and Husserl, in a sense is just giving Heidegger credit for just something like that thought. And then the issue is, and this is where it gets much more delicate, is nonetheless, from Derrida's point of view, Heidegger's insight into that kind of structure turns out to be complicated by all sorts of motifs that seem to call for further deconstructive attention. And in that attention, what Derrida typically finds is that not at the first level, perhaps not at the second level, but sooner or later, Heidegger will make the gesture you were just mentioning of, in the end, we will get just releasement or whatever telos-like structure. And Derrida seems to be, let's say, indefinitely dissatisfied with that situation. So there's an analysis, for example, of justice. I think this is in the Spectres of Marx. Rodrigo and I have talked about this a lot, where Derrida is prepared to say the great thing about Heidegger's thinking of justice is that it's not just joining or gathering or Fug, but there's Unfug built into it. There's got a kind of violence or pollachōs or something of that sort built into it. However, on a second level, Heidegger nonetheless tends to reduce just that element that made his reading on the first level. I'm schematizing in a rather outrageous way. So attractive. So it looks as if in the end the issue between Derrida and Heidegger shouldn't really ever come down to a gotcha moment where he says, Heidegger's being Aristotelian, but more the ongoing negotiation, which I think is most often the case in Derrida's work, the ongoing negotiation of how Heidegger, who in some ways for Derrida is his best friend here, is negotiating that economy. But it seems as though, but this is completely predictable on a deconstructive view of the history of philosophy. It seems as though once we decide that deconstructive reading is such that Plato's pharmacy is possible, so we can separate out something that's happening in Plato's text from everything that goes under the name of Platonism. Once that's a general structure that we can suggest that, let's say, every text of sufficient complexity, try a what's it called, principle formulation, the Gödel undecidability. So any text of sufficient complexity will generate something like that structure or a tension between its semantics and its syntax, to use the terms that Derrida uses here. Then it seems as though what Derrida has had to do to get to the place he could get to, for example, I think demonstrably simplify Aristotle quite often, it's an invitation to go back and do some more Derridian work on just those texts. That maybe for various reasons and at various levels, including reference to Pierre Aubanc, his contemporary at the École Normale, we could speculate maybe for almost contingent reasons, Derrida saw that Aubanc had got the Aristotle market cornered, and at age 31 or something had published this huge, still very influential book about Aristotle. Maybe that didn't seem the best place to go and spend a lot of time for an ambitious young philosopher in 1961 or 2. But maybe that also, in its very contingency, determined a slightly reductive sense of Aristotle that I think most often emerges from Derrida's direct encounters with him. The other thing that's interesting about that is that where Derrida does reference Aubanc's work in La Mythologie Blanche and in the essay on the categories in Benveniste essay on the categories, he attributes things to Aubanc that Aubanc absolutely does not say. So he says, see the wonderful work of Pierre Aubanc on the analogy of being in Aristotle. You open Aubanc's book, the first thing he says is, let's be clear about one thing, there's nothing like the analogy of being in Aristotle, that's a scholastic red herring. So there are strangenesses in that thing which I'm hoping to pursue. But I think in general, the very principles of what I'm calling a generous deconstructive reading seem to make necessary the thought that to get where he got, Derrida had to himself not always be as generous in his readings as perhaps now he's made it possible for us to be. So I do think that there's scope for a rereading of Aristotle somewhat down the general lines I was thinking. That means Aristotle does not have to be that very classical, very Aristotelian, and then by extension, what's happening with Heidegger's Aristotle and how does that affect one's view of Heidegger more generally and so on. That too, in principle, because in practice, of course, as Rodrigo's discovered recently, you might always have to get into fights with Heideggerians or anti-Heideggerians about various aspects of that enterprise.
Sergio, Alberto, Rodrigo, Katie.
So I have a question and then a comment. The question is about if you can explain a little more the idea of the one that is different to the tradition. You in passing mentioned the idea of a one that is different to the tradition in Derrida, and then you say at the same time that there is no scattering without gathering, there is no gathering without scattering. I wonder how you're thinking that idea of the one there, that is obviously different to the tradition. And then this is again changing the reading of Aristotle you are proposing, change not just our book, but Schulman reading of Aristotle precisely is emphasized not just the teleological, but the archaeoteleological structuration of metaphysics. And then, of course, opposed to Aristotle is a late Heidegger that will get not just to the realism, but to the Gelassenheit as a suspension of the Prost-Hen rational archaeoteleological mechanism. So this not just change, and the way you just put it just now, Derrida wasn't that generous sometimes, we should be more generous because we can, which means at the same time that the construction is not a finished enterprise, but actually it's a process of reading that is always open and coming back to the tradition and so on, right? this change at the same time the very relation we have with the theological political tradition, with Christianity and with Platonism and the Aristotelian tradition. So I was wondering if you have any thought regarding, the quarrel of Aristotelian in the 12th, 13th century, particularly, Averroes, Avicenna, those guys that precisely were repressed by Christianity later.
No, there are many places to look, because Aristotelianism is, of course, a huge complex. So that I've not looked at very closely. What I have looked at more closely is some very early Christian appropriations, and especially the way I'm trying to do this to keep it manageable is following the fate of a line from Homer that Aristotle quotes at the end of Book Lambda of the Metaphysics, which is where Odysseus, though many people forget that and claim it's Agamemnon, it's Odysseus who's addressing the soldiers and says, "It's not good that there be many rulers, let there be one leader, one lord," something like that, the exact translation of how we're going to do the terminology. Derrida mentions that himself in Rogues, without mentioning that there's a huge tradition in the appropriation of that quotation, often attributed straightforwardly to Aristotle himself, whereas it's explicitly in Aristotle presented as a quote from Homer. And the bits I followed are partly in the 2nd century Christian apologists who are pulling on that pagan reference and trying to Christianize it in various, actually fairly interesting kind of ways. There's some cruder ways which involve claiming that Plato and Aristotle learnt all they knew from Moses anyway. So, but there are ways in which it's a more interpretive and more interesting move. So I've looked a little bit at that. And then in the 14th century, in the 1320s, in Dante's treatise on monarchy, and in William of Ockham, also, there are ways in which that quotation comes back in a theorizing of sovereignty, monarchy, and so on and so forth. And that is the way in which I'm going to try to pursue these questions, because otherwise I'll be lost in the Aristotelian forests for decades to come. So I'm hoping that something of that can come from it. And the other question was that the point about the gathering scattering, which I said you can state it quite simply. Of course, it's not simple at all, because the question is, maybe you can't think of a gathering that doesn't involve some scattering, and maybe you can't think of a scattering that doesn't involve some gathering. Fine, but can you think of a gathering that isn't committed to the one, in some sense, that isn't teleologically pulled towards some kind of unity that would put an end to the whole thing? So we have to think of it non-dialectically, to think of it non-teleologically. This is really not so easy. But I think that's what Derrida's thinking of différance is fairly explicitly trying to do. I think there are more resources in Aristotle, partly because it's almost like a joke. It's like stand-up in Aristotle, where you've got the pros hen structure. You say, okay, what's this hen that I'm crossing towards? And he says, well, it's said in many ways. And it opens a whole new...
Don't you think that Heidegger's later approach to the quaternary or the fourfold?
Possibly. Okay. But there, what's interesting, I skipped a lot of things in here. I don't have an engagement with Schurman yet that I can say anything interesting about. I'm aware of his work. But part of what I skipped over here is that in the immediate context, in that essay that nobody reads anymore on Solès, where Derrida gives this fairly helpful description of dissemination, he segues pretty rapidly into a discussion of the fourfold, and especially the crossing out of being in the Seinsfrage essay, which is one of Derrida's favorite moments in all of Heidegger, from which he gets the Suratur strategy that he uses first in the grammatology. So that immediately comes up in a way that I think is not insignificant in this context. And there, in that essay, he doesn't go on to be critical of Heidegger, really. He just wheels him in and quotes quite a bit, as if Heidegger was almost unequivocally supporting the kind of position that Derrida is trying to develop.
Jeff, see if I can formulate this carefully enough. There is a moment in Geschlecht III that I did not hear you mention, but I am sure you are very aware of it, which is the moment in which Derrida says, pure Versammlung is death without a phrase, and pure dissemination is also death without a phrase. You know?
Yes.
I don't understand the phrase death without a phrase, by the way. I know that's the way you translate it, but I wonder if there is some mystery in French that I'm not aware of.
Mort sans phrase is it's a reference to Marx, isn't it? Unless it's already in Hegel.
Okay.
It's something about there's nothing to be said at this point. It's just the end in a radical
But
sense.
in that very passage, then I think Derrida equivocates in a not very generous way towards Heidegger by claiming that that Heidegger is in fact looking for death without a phrase in total Versammlung. He talks about purity even, And I agree with your position, but I think that sometimes Derrida is not generous enough and then blinds himself to some of the possibilities of the text he's reading.
No, I think that's probably right. I don't want to overstress that, though. I think there are, as I said, resources in Heidegger, resources in Aristotle, that Derrida, for various reasons that aren't all negative or bad reasons, sometimes at least simplifies or immobilizes or chooses not to pursue. It's hard to see how you could do a reading of the history of Western metaphysics without at least provisionally stabilizing a few points of reference, for whom Derrida, Hegel would be probably the most obvious one. And many people have said, I think in most cases, too rapidly and unfairly or unjustly, that Derrida's Hegel is reductive. He doesn't allow Hegel certain possibilities that some readers of Hegel think you can find in Hegel. And there, I think that's a very bad and reactive position to take. And I'm trying to avoid that with Aristotle, even though there are probably traces of it in this paper, where the point is not to say what Derrida's claiming is already in Aristotle, or what Derrida's claiming is already in Hegel, when read appropriately, partly for the reason that read appropriately there would have to mean read according to Derridian principles. So in a sense, Derrida helps us see the things in Hegel or Aristotle that Derrida has not explicitly brought out or developed. But I do think there's an issue with the gathering motif. I think I have quite a bit of sympathy with Derrida for his impatience with that, given the piety with which those motifs in Heidegger are often accompanied in the Heideggerian world. So what's the Heidegger Circles journal called again, guys? Can have some sympathy with his impatience of a kind of let me just say piety around those gestures. However, obviously we're not going to get very far. I had an exchange with François Raffoul about this at SPED, where François would say, but you can't have your flock of sheep without some principle of gathering. And I'm saying, yeah, you can't have your flock of sheep that's absolutely gathered either. It has to have an element of dispersion in it. And there it's easy to get stuck at that level. And calculating the appropriate gestures, not simply to get into a scatter gathering shouting match, seems important to me. So I don't know if generosity is quite the appropriate way to describe it, but that's where I am right now, which is a strange thing for me to find myself in.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm haunted by maybe a lack of generosity on my part when I ask you this question, because I'm being torn in several directions. So on the one hand, I'm tempted to maybe think you're not being as generous as you could have been to Derrida vis-a-vis the question of generosity in relation to Aristotle. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the first time he uses the expression répétition généreuse is in Ossia and Grammet, where he's very hard and ambitiously attempting to retrieve Aristotle from Heidegger's powerful reading.
Right.
And I mean, that essay, I think, is hands down one of the most difficult things that he has written. And I am even not sure if at the end of the day he succeeds in showing you how Aristotle does not think time on the basis of the noon, of the now, in that lineage that Heidegger highlights in that footnote to being in time. So that's me saying that you're not being that generous. But then I'm tempted to think that you're being perhaps too generous, just like Derrida is being perhaps too generous to Aristotle, when we seem to think Aristotle is thinking, say, dissemination and différence. That's certainly one of the suggestions Derrida makes in Lucia and Grammy, how Aristotle's complication of Heidegger's temporality opens on to the thought of dissemination. Because come to think of this expression, toon legetai pollachōs. So you could say, in fact, that even the one, or even tos hen legetai pollachōs, you could say that even the to hen legetai pollachōs, but also you could also say the same thing of the pollachōs legetai. But could you say the same thing about legetai? Is Aristotle prepared to say legetai pollachōs? It seems like
I think so.
He doesn't. There's no moment.
Explicitly.
There's no moment. There's no moment in the metaphysics where he comes back to the question of legging, and is prepared to say that legging itself is multiple. So, I guess I'm just torn between being not generous enough to Derrida's Aristotle, but also maybe being too generous to Aristotle himself, who I don't know, thinking of the name gathering as, the appropriate name. Aristotle's name here would be pros hen. Let's be part of the pros hen circle. That doesn't seem very nice.
Well, it depends how you read the pros hen, right? So I do think that the focal meaning, which is what Derrida's picked up probably via Aubalk from the Anglo-American commentaries on Aristotle in the 50s and 60s. Focal meaning was introduced famously in a paper by this guy called Owens in 61, I think. And became the dominant way of understanding it. And then this impressive book by a guy called Christopher Shields in the late 90s pushed the notion of core-dependent homonymy. And these are smart people working with complex materials, and it's taken me a long time to work through it. But I'm instinctively suspicious of both of them, that I think the foyer, the focal meaning, for reasons that Shields partly gives, is something one might be suspicious of. But I also think that Shields himself, who's interestingly very dismissive of Wittgensteinian family resemblance kind of talk, because he thinks it's still too scattered, wants to have this notion of a core. But if there's one thing that a Derridian semantics, if we can even use that notion, does not have, is a core. The trace structure is not a core-based or a focused structure in those kinds of ways. Now, the trick would be to see to what extent, in order to have that thought, Aristotle is dismissible. And for me at the moment it seems not. It seems as if there's plenty of interesting stuff in Aristotle, at least to pursue along those lines. The pollachōs, legetai-pollachōs idea is an interesting one. I'm inclined to think that the pollachōs, as applied to the other things which Aristotle says are said in many ways, is probably also affecting the pollachōs, the legetai itself. So the lege itself is being affected by the multiplicity of the ways in which this is said, that is said, the other thing is said. There are many different things. I haven't made the complete list in the metaphysics, probably a dozen different things that Aristotle starts by saying this is said in.
But you kind of needed the Derridian to see that in Aristotle, I think.
Yes.
Maybe
sure.
a Heideggerian can't quite see that.
That's part of my claim, which is why I'm a Derridian.
Did you have a question?
Do we have time? It's a really, I'll ask it really, really quickly, which is, Jeff, to what extent do you think Geschlecht can take its place in that series of quasi-synonymous non-synonyms next to hymen pharmacon?
I don't know. I'm puzzled about that. That's probably not worked out here, though. As I read it out, I thought perhaps I could have skipped that claim, because I'll get into trouble with it. Partly the complication for me is that Heidegger's discussion of Mehrdeutigkeit has nothing at all to do with the term Geschlecht in that essay. And somehow in the Derridian reading, the two get put together in a way that I think I'm going to need to unpack a little bit more carefully. But it seems as though the multiplicity that is in play in the term Geschlecht is just not there, that Derrida does his polysemia dissemination thing, and it's not there that Heidegger develops his notion of Mehrdeutigkeit that Derrida is contesting. It does seem as if, could you imagine Aristotle saying Geschlecht, pollachōs, legetai? It seems as if it's answerable in some ways to those terms that Aristotle is struck by the multiplicity of saying of.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Heterosexual German is not a